Hi there, I'm Jeff Johnson, and I want to share with you the book that I chose to read. It's entitled Controlling People, and the author is Patricia Evans. The title goes on to say how to recognize, understand, and deal with people who try to control you. Our author covers a number of things in here, and when you read this title, you look at this and think, oh wow, this is going to be a good book for me to read so that I can understand how to deal with all those bad controlling people out there, so that I can know how to put them in their place, so that I can deal with them appropriately, and so that I can take back some of my control myself, when in fact, the things that she tells us here would cause us all to believe that we have been controlling people at some time or another. She begins with a couple of very plain statements that really anybody who's had a conflict would probably have shared or at least thought. And one of those things is, you just don't know what you're talking about. And another statement that she said was, you're just too sensitive. And whether we've said that or whether we've thought that, we've come into a situation where we try to define somebody else. We try to, in our own mind at least, tell them what they are thinking, tell them how they are behaving, and we tell them how they ought to behave. And that's what this book is all about. You see, one of my favorite chapters in here has to do with good intentions. And we can have some marvelous intentions to try to help other people. And we find that good intentions can be wonderful things until they provide unintended consequences. Yeah, good intentions will do that sometimes. The title that she has in chapter 3 said, Good Intentions That All Went Wrong. Well, you know, we can do that sometimes, and we're believing that we know what's best for someone, and we think we know what they're thinking, we think we know what they need, when in truth, well, we really miss the boat. And sometimes those good intentions can lead us to make hasty decisions. Our writer tells us about a miller's daughter story, where one who owned a mill made a hasty decision to sell a piece of property and everything that was on it, because the one who wanted the property had said he wanted the apple tree. The miller didn't understand that his daughter was playing in the apple tree. So hasty decisions can create a problem. It reminds me of things that we find within the pages of God's Word. Jephthah is a man that we find in Judges chapter 11, beginning at verse 29. He made a tragic vow there with the best of intentions. He had promised God that if God would provide him victory over the Amorites, he would sacrifice the very first thing he came in contact with when he returned home safe and sound. And what did he come in contact with but his own daughter? His good intentions really set him up for trouble. Now, when we look at that in the grand scheme of things, what we can find is good intentions that would squelch the feelings of grief and squelch other things and just avoid dealing with those feelings altogether are good intentions that in fact are headed for trouble. Our writer goes on to tell us that those good intentions can cause us to make backward connections with people. Instead of allowing people to be who they are and allowing them and encouraging them to be who they are, the controller has a tendency to want to put them in a box. I want you to behave a certain way. As a matter of fact, the controller will go to the extent of practicing something that she refers to as the teddy principle. That's when you would have a teddy bear as a child, and this teddy bear would be your friend. And you would take the teddy bear when you left in the morning, and you would put the teddy bear on the bed. And then you would come back later in the day and you would tell the teddy bear all about your day. And in your mind's ear, you would hear the teddy saying, oh, what a wonderful day you had. I'm just so proud of you. And the teddy is so interested in everything that you're doing. And you say, well, the teddy didn't have anything to do but to lay there on that bed and wait on me all day long. You see, the fact is, we can apply that principle to people. My dad used to say sometimes that there are people who have the idea that if they're not in your presence, that you go inanimate, that you're just waiting for them to come back into your presence. Well, you see, that's the principle we're talking about here. This idea that someone else is just waiting and they're thinking the way that you would have them to think. And so you put them in this little box. And what we don't realize is that when we treat a live human being that way, what we're doing is creating an impressive environment, pressing down on them an oppressive environment so that they will in fact become resentful potentially. And then what happens is sometimes a person will be resistant to that very kind of thing. Imagine, if you will, a man who is an elder at a congregation who has had great responsibility in the world and had great respect and honor. And as a matter of fact, people just didn't question him in the areas in which he served. And now being retired, he serving as an elder, had the idea that he had that same kind of authority. So he put everybody in this box. And the box is that you need to listen to me and you won't challenge me because I know what's best for everybody. Now, with a good intention, he's really placing everyone in a position to really have some frustration, some desire to resist him. Even in the smallest of things, people may find themselves pushing back because they just don't want to be controlled. It's the normal human spirit to avoid being controlled by someone else. And what we see here is the book tells us that, in fact, the best of intended people may find themselves being a controller at some point. One of the things that caused me to have to spend so much time digesting this book was the introspective questions I considered. Have I been guilty of being the controlling person? You know, I might excuse my behavior with the best of intentions, and yet perhaps I have done some of the very things that she talks about here. And as the reader goes through this book, it's a challenge for you, because most people, I believe, will find themselves being described as one of the offenders at some point or another. Now, our writer goes to great extent to describe how the offenders are actually people who are under a spell, as she put it. And that spell, that collection of illusions, is something that has caused one to be beside themselves. She uses that phrase in such a way that we're familiar with. He was beside himself with anger. She was beside herself with fear. He was beside himself and didn't know what to do. And when we think about those things, we too can be beside ourselves. And what that is an intense period of disconnection from feeling, an intense disconnection from intuition, because we don't perceive that the actions we're involved in are actually going to have a negative impact on our relationships, a negative impact on others. We lose that sense of protection in that we don't consider what we say to be something that could be actually long-term as far as affecting relationships. We don't consider it to be something that could be long-term as far as destroying relationships. We just think in the moment, I need some relief from the frustration of being under this spell. And it's even recorded by our author that sometimes people can't even remember the times when they were beside themselves. Now, when that happens upon occasion for most people, we hand them a pass card. We know that that's not their normal behavior. As a matter of fact, that's why we describe it that way. He was beside himself. But then there are those who act that way habitually. And we find ourselves avoiding those people. And people who are controlling, and people who are those who are trying to put us in oppressive positions, are those that create an environment that alienates them from everyone else. And so the problem is just continuing to grow exponentially, because the person who feels the need to put someone in that box, if you will, someone in that controlled position, when that controlled position person begins to exhibit resistance or even tries to escape, the oppressor comes on stronger with even more oppression. So what we find is a very good book on self-introspection. On the back cover, there are questions that she asked that make us think about dealing with others. The questions are, do you know someone who always has a need to be right? Do you know someone who tells you who you are and what you think? Do you know someone that implies you're wrong or inadequate when you don't agree with them? Do you know someone who's threatened by different people? Do you know someone who feels attacked when questioned? And do you know someone who doesn't seem to really hear you or see you? You see, the controlling person is one who tells you how to feel. They tell you what you are to look like, and they tell you how you are to be. And when they are made uncomfortable by those who don't fit in their box, why, they respond in a most negative fashion. Our writer goes on to talk about those tactics of elevation when the controller is threatened, tightening their grip on someone else. There might be a more of a control in a home situation, or more of a control with children, or more of a control in the workplace, trying to clamp down on those who are wandering outside the box. And then our writer goes on to say verbal abuse as a tactic, not just tightening down policies and behaviors, but verbal abuse. And when that's exhibited with anger, why, it really has an effect on those who are round about. Now, I know someone who, in an effort to control others, would throw things across a room or enter someone's private space in order to try to provide that intimidation. And not that this person would actually do anything physical, but yet their impression was that they would if you didn't fall in line with what they wanted you to do. Our writer continues with the tactics she describes. One she names as stalking. Now, stalking, we know, is someone that perhaps has escaped the control box, and so they're outside the norm. So since the controller cannot control them directly, what they will do is follow them around. This is another tactic of intimidation, not very far different than verbal abuse or throwing things, if you will. This kind of intimidation causes one to change their behaviors, and that's really what the controller is after. They want to see a demonstration of changed behavior. Our writer tells us about road rage, and we find that to be more common than we would ever want it to be. In road rage, we see someone has turned in front of someone's cut someone off in traffic, and then a battle ensues. The one who has done the infraction may or may not feel bad about what they have done if they in fact really did something that was illegal. Lots of times it's not illegal, they just take advantage of an opportunity to go where they can go. And the person who is exhibiting the road rage is really the one who feels like they were taken advantage of because they didn't act the way that you would expect them to act. You need to wait on me for me to go through, and then you can fall in behind me. But no, you had to cut in front of me. And those kinds of discussions go through the mind of the person who is involved in road rage, and the next thing you know, cars are being crashed or guns are being fired and people are being injured over nothing more than a quick turn at an intersection. And the excuses that come along with these behaviors are nothing more than our writer describes as confabulations. Confabulations, a word meaning that something that we have made up. Why, we'll get angry over something that we've made up. Controlling people will do that very thing, make up something to get angry, just so they can intimidate, as our writer calls them, the witnesses, or I would refer to them as the receivers of this kind of abuse, because in fact, controlling people are exhibiting some abuse, and what they do is they try to force others to do things against their will. And then we find that there are witnesses who for long periods of time tolerate these kinds of behaviors, sometimes because it's an authority figure in the workplace, or maybe it's an authority figure in the home. Needless to say, controlling behavior is not something that we really want to be a part of, and we need to realize that, and this book is really a good way to investigate oneself whether or not you're guilty. Now, Ms. Evans goes on to tell us that our freedom to choose is about our most basic freedom. And with that, we know as Christians that God has provided for us the ability to choose how we behave. Now, the person who is controlling others will most likely blame other circumstances on his control. So I'd like to share with you a few things that I have learned by reading this book. First of all, preachers and elders need to be very well aware of the potential of losing compassion and losing that connectedness with compassion, and that's what we would call here, according to Ms. Evans' definition, as feeling, losing that connection with that feeling or compassion, and losing that connection with the intuition that warns you that this behavior is not going to be good for the future. So what we would want to do is take the points that our author shows us, learn from those, and then employ some biblical strategies to improve our lives and improve our relationships. Now, in considering a biblical strategy, have you ever thought about the fact that Peter tried to control Jesus? We find record of that in Matthew chapter 16. And we come down to verse 23, and when Jesus acknowledged that Peter was trying to control him, as Jesus had explained what was going to happen in the future, and Peter denied that that would be allowed to happen, and Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan." Now, Peter remembered all of these things, and what we find is Peter was willing to defend the Savior even in the garden to the drawing of a sword. And then we see that Peter fell victim to what was prophesied in that he would deny Jesus. And when he came to himself, he went out and wept bitterly over that very thing. And then we see a dedicated change. We see Peter being a man who was very passionate about taking the gospel to the world round about him. And when we find ourselves in a position of incorrectly behaving in such a way that we're trying to control someone else, it's time that we back up and take some time so that we treat people the way they deserve to be treated. I hope that I've been able to share with you effectively some things that I've learned, and I thank you for this opportunity to share.